Hello there and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to this special coverage over the French election presidency. On the 24th of April evening, the French television in a live broadcast announced that Emmanuel Macron, the current president, has been re-elected for a second term against Marine Le Pen, with about 58% of the vote in the second round of the election. Macron now is the third president in the French history to win a second term after François Mitterrand in 1988 and Jacques Chirac in 2002. But after a first mandate strongly questioned by the French, in particular in the management of the health crisis, the decline in purchasing power, and some random social measures, will he convince this time and be the president of all the French? And what are the missteps not to be reproduced? To answer these questions, I'm joined live via Skype from France by Mr. Jacques Cheminat, head of Solidarity and Progress Party, the French arm of La Rouge movement, and who has a three-time contested the presidency of France. And also from Paris, Manuel Pouchelet, university lecturer and geopolitical analyst, along with Abdel Nour Toumi, journalist and Maghreb studies expert at Orzam Center, Turkey. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us in this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into our discussion, Emmanuel Macron has won 5 more years as France's president after a convincing victory over rival Marine Le Pen, who nevertheless secured the far-right's highest share of the vote yet. Mr. Macron said in his victory speech, an answer must be found to the anger and disagreement that led many of our competitors to vote for the extreme right. It will be my responsibility and that of those around me.
Je sais aussi que nombre de nos compatriotes ont voté ce jour pour moi.
I know that many of our compatriots voted for me today, not to support the ideas that I hold, but to block those at the far right. I want to thank them here and tell them that I'm aware that this vote binds me for the years to come. I'm the custodian of their sense of duty, of their attachment to the Republic, of respect for the differences that have been expressed in recent weeks.
Et du respect des différences qui se sont exprimées ces dernières semaines.
Mr. Cheminat, have the French really voted for Macron or against Le Pen? Because based on the statistics given out of this election, the final rate of abstention reached the 28%, which is the highest level for presidential runoff since 1969. Don't you think that this is a reflection of the untrusted relation between candidates and citizens?
Something. 28% abstentions, but also blank vote 4.6%, and null and void 1.6%. In total, 34.3% of the registered voters. So if you look at the registered voters, Macron's vote is only of 38.5%. So it's not what it looks apparently as a big victory. It's not. And if you look at a few more things, it's very interesting. In the first round, 60% of the voters supported candidates which were in favor of France leaving NATO's integrated command. Macron is for staying. So you have really an opposition from the French population in foreign policy to what Macron is saying. Besides, another very interesting thing is the vote in Martinique, Guadeloupe, and French Guiana. There in the first round, Mélenchon got more than 50% of the vote, which was a remarkable result. And then in the second round, Marine Le Pen got 61% in Martinique and Guyana and French Guiana, and 17% in Guadeloupe. This proves that there is an electorate which I called the popular unit. This electorate, which appears more clearly in the French West Indies, in the French Antilles, and it's, I think, a precursor of what should happen in my country, which is a bloc of popular union made of people which are not Macron, which are not Mélenchon, neither Marine Le Pen, who are new figures, and these new figures are respected by the population.
Understood. Mr. Manuel, don't you think that, as in 2017, the ultimate debate between Macron and Le Pen was the winning card for Emmanuel Macron because of having been very good in communication and destabilization in front of her? Le Pen only justified her program instead of attacking Macron on his flaws during the 5 years term. Did this debate discredit the far-right candidate who, according to some observers, was off to a good start?
Yes, I think considering the latest debate, which was done last Wednesday, it was very interesting to understand Mrs. Le Pen's position because she has an interesting program, but in fact the program is only oriented with citizens and not with foreign policy, and it's always the same subject. I mean, immigration, purchase power. Without any real key figures, instead of Mr. Macron, who was able to give key figures of his program, of his latest review. So the French voters yesterday decided to vote Mr. Macron, to reconduct Mr. Macron, because maybe he's the latest president who is able to face with the new challenges for the future of France. I mean, he's with European questions, military questions, and of course, other important topics like environment, new technology, and so on. But Mrs. Le Pen was not really able to answer this question. But, however, I would like to underline a very important thing too. Mrs. Le Pen is a candidate of the population. I mean, from the countryside and, like Mr. Chemidad said, also in the French foreign territories, overseas territories, where she has very good results. So we have to take this into account for the future of France. And yesterday, during the the electoral evening, we had a lot of candidates on candidate spokesperson. We decided today we launch the legislative battle, and it will start from now.
Quite understood. Coming to you, Mr. Abdel Noor, to me, the two candidates' program toward the Muslim community and Islam in general, which is the second largest religion in France, is really different. The far-right candidates are always extremists, and Le Pen, this time, even wanted to challenge one of the old French society principles, secularism, laicity, by saying, I will prevent hijab in France and apply strict restriction over those communities. So don't you think that all Muslim community and even other religious group went all toward Macron as the only choice they have, not because they want Macron?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me, sir, again. Actually, it's a very good question in this dynamic of the unheard of and awkward presidential campaign. As far as the Muslim vote goes this time, to speak with, generally speaking, Muslims don't vote as, I would say, homogeneous bulk, and also there is no such a Muslim community. There are Muslim communities. Now, and we saw that this time in this specific election, because of its awkwardness, the Muslim vote showed some strength, and going out and vote en masse this time for the candidate of France Insoumise, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, in the first round. And he earned, or he got around 69% of the Muslim vote, interestingly enough, and like in 2017, where around 70 to 75% of the Muslim vote went to Macron. So what happened then and today, many things happened under the first term of President-elect Emmanuel Macron, and started actually just in the aftermath of autumn. First, I would say, the days of the yellow vest, and he felt the rays of the far right that they will be challenging him. I mean, at that moment, before the COVID-19 appeared on public and again marginalized or cornered the social issues, he positioned himself on the posture of what happened yesterday, looking for a rematch with Marine Le Pen. But his policies, public policies toward Muslims, went terrible. He is the one who actually made or stated that Islam is in crisis, and his policy about the so-called Islamic separatism, that, he changed it and he framed it into enhancing the Republic values and making the French motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité. He took out fraternity and he added it with laicity. And it's an interesting point here to mention. The difference between the French laicity and the secularism that we heard or we know in the Anglo-Saxon is totally different. So the Muslims here are actually positioning themselves between the candidate, the finalists of yesterday, Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen. Of course, they were unhappy with Marine Le Pen because of her political heritage and legacy that goes back to her father. And there is another point here. The question of the Islamic headscarf here is not new. It went, the trajectory of this narrative, it went from its, I would say, ethnic paradigm into a religious paradigm. And then now when we see, unfortunately, in the French political debate, and this is why France is in this mess these days and in the aftermath of the result of this election, because there is no such a debate on the deep and serious issues such as what I'm kind of trying to, and both Muslims and their fellow citizens, French, are worried about the purchasing of power and the cost of living that is hurting them these days.
Quite understood. Now, all right, moving on to the second point. Marine Le Pen brought the far right from frightening status into a mainstream in a decade and unbowed by her third failed bid for the presidency. She promised on Sunday to keep up the fight against Emmanuel Macron as she turned her attention to June's parliamentary votes. Let's have a listen to her words.
With more than 43% of the votes, tonight's result represents in itself a bright victory.
Coming back to you, Mr. Cheminade, just after the results comes out to the scene announcing Macron won the election, Le Pen delivered a speech focused on 3 points, saying that first, 42% for the far right, this time it's already a victory. Secondly, she stated that she is going to be the leader of the opposition in the country. Third, she said that I won't stop here. 2 months from now, parliamentary votes should be run out in our favor, the opposition, which means she's looking to establish her control from parliament. To this point, Mr. Cheminade, what are you saying about her speech and these raised points?
Well, I want to say what the experts are doing. They are saying that the French population, the French voters, are divided in 3/3. 1/3, which is liberal, the Macron vote, another 1/3, which is nationalist, the Le Pen vote, and a third, which is leftist. This is apparently true. In fact, it's wrong, because the truth is that this presidential election was from an abysmal level, very low level. These two candidates, Macron and Le Pen, failed to come to grips with the real issues. The real issues in our country, nationally, is an inflation making life too expensive for 2/3 of the population, for eating, for housing, for lighting up, also for paying the gasoline to go to work, because the working place is far from the place where you live. So these are the real issues nationally. Internationally, the real issue is the world economic disintegration, which is coming, and the threat of a permanent warfare. None of this was dealt with. So what we need is a force in the country dealing with these issues. It's a popular force. It's about 2/3 of the voters. It could not be with the present ideologies. It could not be with Marine Le Pen and Mélenchon, who are the two voters who got the working class or the middle and lower classes vote. It should be with new representatives. And this is what we are fighting for, with the spirit of de Gaulle and Jaurès, the spirit, I must say, of the preamble of the French Constitution, and also the joyful spirit that I had when I was in Algiers in the Pan-African Festival in July 1961. So, in that sense, Marine Le Pen cannot represent the opposition, Mélenchon cannot represent the opposition, a new force has to surge.
That's quite important. Mr. Chemina, staying with you, don't you think that this time Macron really didn't have a challenge of the presidency?
A challenge of what sort?
Challenge of the chair, because taking into consideration, Macron didn't even run for the campaign. He was dealing with the Ukraine crisis and he used it as a campaign. Don't you think that it was really good for him to use this?
Oh, yes. He played on the fear of the French people. It was played on the fear and on the legitimacy issue. So hiding the real problems, his real failures, his real misdoings, and his lack of program for the future, except antisocial measures, like the need to work if you get the RSA, the assistance fund, when you don't work, or also putting the age of pension, the pension age, at 65. So all these antisocial measures, he said it, and it was not considered by the population, or because the election was distorted, and there was a great push for a so-called Republican front against Marine Le Pen. You have Libération, Le Figaro, Le Monde, Paris Match, all these French publications, and also the radios, the television, saying you have to work with Macron because Le Pen is such a real danger. So this whitewashing of Macron cannot last. And I think what's coming is a new, and I insist on that, a new opposition, a new type of opposition, which has to drop aside old ideologies, was to drop aside also the question of personal ambitions, and to think about listening to the French people and seeing reality with the eyes of the future and not the eyes of the past.
In the same line of thought, Mr. Buchley, don't you think that what happened, what helped Macron to stay on presidency is the unstable situation in Europe and Ukraine crisis? And we all know in politics, time of war is not time of change. This is why people keep Macron on the seat.
Yes, I think that today we have to underline that before in 2017, I think that French population didn't have any idea of the international interaction on the French policy and, of course, the French life. But today, in 2022, with the arrival of the Ukraine crisis and, of course, the other crisis with fighting against terrorism all over the world, we have a deep impact on today's population life. I mean, the middle class is today suffering from a booming of the budget, I mean oil budget, and of course other budget, food budget too. It has become difficult to live in France today. Of course, the retirees have big difficulties to live today because pensions are very low, and it's time to conduct reforms. And of course, Mr. Macron program, I think, will focus on more social aspects than before. We know that the campaign was mostly about the purchase power, which is very important in France because today it's very low. And of course, because due of an important increase of prices. But what we have to take into consideration that Mr. Macron is also pro-Europe, and the European Union today has an impact on French life. And Mr. Macron said, okay, with Europe, we will help France to be better. But of course, French citizens are always skeptic with Europe. The latest key figures concerning the latest European elections with abstention, the abstention is very high. So it's very difficult to understand this. But Mr. Macron has a foreign policy, and he hopes that this foreign policy will help France to carry out new challenges, and it will help the French society to get better.
Perfectly understood. Quite, and sorry to cut your chain of thoughts. Now, Mr. Chomi, France has never reached major tensions with Algeria with any president before, except with Macron. He dared to question Algeria's history, and after this irresponsible statement, France has sought to correct the situation via diplomatic missions every time. But how can you see the future relations with France's Macron, bearing in mind that France needed stronger relations with Algeria?
I think this time, I mean, the actually entire MENA policy, I mean, Middle East, North Africa policy of President Macron has to be reviewed, because in his first time, we all know it was a fiasco. I mean, starting in Syria, going to Libya, and then the crisis in Lebanon now, and the latest political impasse and institutional impasse in Tunisia. Now, as far as the relations between Algeria and France go, it is interesting, because this time, and as you stated, actually, I mean, during the last 6 years' relations, it was the first time when a French president dared to question, actually, again, to some extent, the legitimacy of the Algerian authorities, and going beyond that, questioning the existence of the Algerian nation. And I think this was, we got it at that time. He said it in a pre-election time and pre-campaign, and the message, again, was sent to his eventual or virtual voters on the far-right movement. And I mean, just to make a point on these far-right things, because he demystified and he banalized the message and the discourse of the far-right. Now, President Macron, he has to look for a new parameters of on the relations between the two countries, between Algeria and France. As we all know, are not that natural relations. They are subnaturals, and we all know the details about that, and how France now, in the light of the crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, and its dependence on the Russian oil and gas, and how the new, I mean, the has to put or to position his foreign policy on a new posture, on the, I mean, to enhance the ties between Algiers and Paris on the matter of economic exchange. I mean, fortified economic exchange, and then commerce exchange, and will be mainly on the gas issue, because now France is looking at Algiers as another, to Algeria in this sense, as another alternative to the Russian war, and also trying to multiply its alternatives vis-à-vis the Gulf countries. But we all know the relations between Algeria and France on this issue are tight, and they need to be developed further. And he has to create a new element based on mutual respect and trust toward the Algerian authorities, because now Algerian authorities are also having a new doctrine, foreign policy that goes with diversification of partners, and we saw the latest developments on the field, and let's say the strategic rapprochement with between Algiers and Rome, and this is will, I would say, destabilize a little bit Macron's foreign policy parameters. This is why he had to look at it. And also there are two other elements, the situation in the Sahel, African Sahel, and also the question of the migrants as well.
Quite understood. Shortly after the announcement of the victory of the outgoing President Emmanuel Macron over his rival Marine Le Pen, several hundred demonstrators took the streets in Paris. Despite a large deployment of the police, protesters claim that they don't want Le Pen, but also disagree on Macron's re-election due to his policy. Several garbage fires were tilled by demonstrators, and the police sprayed tear gas on protesters. Mr. Cheminade, how can you explain this protest that occurred last night? Do you think that Macron was forced to be the president and people would have chosen another president if they have had a better choice than Le Pen?
Well, probably yes. They would have voted for a better choice than Le Pen at this point. But the French elite, so-called elite, and the French population was at this point unable to generate that candidate. So, in fact, what's happening now is that Macron, every time something happens against him, he calls the police and there is a repression. This is what happens, and you see the way it happens. So, at the same time, there is a provocation to create that and to create problems for the country, inspired sometimes from outside forces that want to create instability in France. So I expect a fall or a winter, probably a fall earlier, of discontent in this country because the Macron environment, the Macron people that surround him, cannot lead a policy in the interest of the nation because they have their prejudices. And I think to speak about the relations between France and Algeria in this context, the young generations expect a win-win cooperation, expect a new policy, and I think profoundly that this policy cannot be within the Western alignment of things at this point, and Macron has put himself inside this Western alignment, including inside NATO. It should be inside a new type of, I must say, cooperation, a new type of development, which will include other countries of the world for the benefit of all. Our institution, the Schiller Institute, is fighting for that, and France has to be and could be a part of it, because we have Trumps, and we don't play these Trumps. The Trumps are nuclear energy, both civilian and military. The Trumps are our seat at the UN Security Council. We have still a service-oriented public sector, and we have a French presidency. So these cards have not been played. During the socialist governments, they had everything. They have a majority in the presidency, in the National Assembly, in the Senate, in all the sectors, in all the French regions, and they did nothing with it. I fear that Macron also is playing with quite a political gift on these various things, but in depth he's doing nothing. So we expect people that would do something about that for at least the interest of the French population and for the world, because France is only France when it does good things for the world.
Briefly, Mr. Pushley, we are running out of time. Mr. Pushley, how can you describe Macron's first amendment? Was it a success or failure? And how is going to manage the second one?
So I think as a conclusion, I can say that famous General de Gaulle sentence, promises are made to be elected, not kept. But today, Mr. Macron has to challenge a new future of France, and he will battle and struggle with other head of states, mainly America and Russia too, and maybe also China. And it will be a challenge. But also the first step for the new mandate for Mr. Macron is today to face with population needs and expectations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. Chumi, in a couple of words, what would you say about the future of France with Macron?
Well, I expect that he would finally understand the fundamental interest of the nation that he has to serve. Until now, he has not done it. So we should put the maximum pressure on the presidency to change. And this is our task. It's also to create in France something that breaks through 40 years of adaptation to the rules-based order of the City of London and Wall Street. We need another policy from France, a real policy in the interest of the nation, and that the interest of the nation corresponds to the needs of the world. And we are facing a tragic situation with a threat of permanent war and with a threat also of a dislocation, an economic dislocation.
Perfectly.
And Macron will have to face a challenge.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jacques Cheminade, Mr. Pushley, and Mr. Abdelnour Toumi. Thank you so much for joining us in this debate. The lack of time, otherwise we will stay here. Thank you so much. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. A special coverage will be held also tomorrow. It's going to be about the Ukraine crisis. For now, have a blessed evening.